and welcome to the podcast of the Gem State Substack. I'm your host, Brian Ullman. If you're not already subscribed, I invite you to do that now over at gemstate.substack.com. Free subscribers get multiple posts a week, while for the cost of a cup of coffee each week, you can support my work and get exclusive features and early access to articles, videos, podcasts, and more. I really appreciate it. How well do you remember George Orwell's 1984? The main character, Winston Smith, worked in a place called the Ministry of Truth, rewriting old newspaper articles and books to conform with the ever-changing narrative of the party. In the world of the novel, truth was not determined by reality, rather reality itself was shaped by the regime. It is cliché now to call something Orwellian, but that doesn't make it any less true. Our own regime aspires to rewrite our own past with as much verve as Orwell's Ministry of Truth. Consider what is happening right now at Arlington National Cemetery. In 1914, nearly 50 years after the end of the Civil War, the Daughters of the Confederacy unveiled a monument at Arlington that symbolized peace and reconciliation while honoring their ancestors. The monument had been commissioned shortly after the Spanish-American War of 1898, in which the grandsons of Northerners and Southerners fought side by side as Americans once again. At the base of the monument is inscribed the Bible verse, "They have beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks." The whole point of the monument was to demonstrate that the war was over and that North and South were reunited. That unification powered our country through the tumultuous 20th century. But it's now being undone in the name of woke social justice ideology. The left is relitigating the Civil War with Confederate soldiers as proxies for their modern enemies on the right. Every monument they remove, every statue they melt down, and every body they exhume is a preview of what they would do to us if the opportunity arose. Unfortunately, many Republicans are facilitating this destruction of our own history. Congress passed a law in 2020 to remove any reminders of the Confederacy from U.S. military installations, including the names of bases, no more Fort Bragg, as well as monuments like the one in Arlington. President Donald Trump vetoed that bill, but Congress, including Idaho's own Congressman Mike Simpson, voted to override that veto. The Confederate Reconciliation Monument is being dismantled as I speak, another piece of our history erased as if it never existed. Senator Ben Adams of Nampa put it succinctly on Twitter, saying, quote, "It won't be long before they tell us we never actually reconciled." End quote. You see, that is the whole point of erasing a nation's history, to make future generations unaware of it. The thought leaders of our current regime would very much like to change history, so that post-war reconciliation never happened, and that traitors to America, however so defined, have always been punished rather than pardoned. Remember that they see you and me as traitors to America as well. Sean Davis, the co-founder of The Federalist, explained the issue well on Twitter this morning. Quote, "The destruction of the Reconciliation Monument is so much worse than mere iconoclasm, which is bad enough by itself. The only reason to make a scene of destroying a monument to the reconciliation of two sides who are at war with each other is to signal that reconciliation, going forward, will also not be tolerated. Right now, the left is gleefully throwing its political enemies in prison for non-existent crimes. This includes the left's chief political opponent. It is setting up bogus kangaroo courts to obtain fraudulent indictments and convictions. The left fantasizes about using the military power of the state to drop nuclear bombs on citizens who exercise their constitutional right of self-defense. As we speak, it is using government power and coercion to illegally censor and shut down the speech of its enemies. And, most dangerous of all, through insane and outrageous assassination prep agitprop, the left and its loyal media propagandists are ginning up their most ardent and unstable supporters to commit violence against the potential next President of the United States. The modern American left clearly has zero interest in reconciliation with anyone in this country who opposes their political agenda. They are not disguising this hatred. In fact, they are so open about their refusal to ever allow anyone else to wield power or even exist outside their clutches that they're willing to rip out and destroy a literal monument to American reconciliation. What do you think they'll do to you if you ever get in their way? End quote. Another Twitter pundit, Chadwick Moore, put it much more succinctly. Quote, "It's worse than hollow race pandering. The regime that labeled half the country domestic terrorists and arrested the leader of the opposition party is now warning that reconciliation is no longer an option." End quote. The purpose of historical revisionism is not merely to change the past, but to change the present and the future. You and I know the value of teaching our children the stories of our ancestors. But what if we had no ancestors? What if we had no past? What if the past was merely a plaything for the regime in power today? If they can shape what you believe about your own past, then they can shape the future by narrowing the scope of what you believe is possible. You can see this same motivation in the way that historical characters are being recast as ethnic and sexual minorities. Occasionally casting an actor of different ethnicity in the role of a historical figure is one thing. Denzel Washington's a great actor, so seeing his take on Macbeth was interesting. But it's become farcical at this point. There's no argument that this is simply casting the best actor for any given role because it obviously only goes one way. No white actor will ever be cast as Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, or Barack Obama, although the memes showing Ryan Gosling as all these figures are definitely amusing. The BBC has become notorious for this kind of historical revisionism. Not only have they recast characters such as Friar Tuck and Margaret of Anjou as African, but even their supposedly accurate documentaries try to say that the average legionary soldier in Roman Britain was black. In the United States, Netflix is leading the charge. It's become a meme at this point. Go on social media and you can find pictures of black bears labeled as polar bears in a potential Netflix documentary. However, the country of Egypt actually filed a lawsuit earlier this year against that platform for producing a quasi-documentary that depicted Cleopatra as a black woman. Whereas changing the race of historical characters has become the norm in the US and Europe, the Egyptians are still proud of their heritage and they'll vigorously defend it. I only watched Netflix's TV show The Crown halfway through season 2, because it started to feel more like a soap opera than an historical drama. However, one of the people I follow on Twitter, Peachy Keenan, finished the show and enjoyed it, but she reported that Netflix went out of their way to fill a period scene with modern diversity. Quote, "The finale of The Crown got me good. Wonderful. A+. But I had to laugh at the Ritz episode where teenage Liz and Margaret party with American GIs on VE Day. In the party scene, 80% of the GIs are black or gay. There's even a makeout between two men, one black, one white. Porchy is led to the dance floor by a transgender guy in lipstick. No one comments on this. It's treated as just a normal part of life in 1945 London. Comically stupid. But the rest of the series was gold." End quote. This sort of thing is even more insidious than reimagining the famous figures of history. Most people know that Cleopatra, Beethoven, or Isaac Newton were not really black, and making them so in the latest period piece is merely artistic license. But fill the background with enough diverse extras and people might really believe that this is what Britain or the US always looked like. In this era of mass migration, demographic change, and sexual licentiousness, it's in the interest of the ruling regime to rewrite history and make you think that it was always such. America was never a majority European and Christian nation. What are you talking about? Britain has always been an ethnically diverse country. How could you possibly oppose unlimited migration from Africa and Asia today? This revisionism is a form of historical gaslighting, making people believe that any objection to the current narrative is a form of psychosis. The communists knew that to maintain control over a population required a permanent state of revolution. Orwell himself explains this in 1984. The party essentially created its own rebellion by either fabricating or manipulating the dissident Emmanuel Goldstein and using that supposed rebellion as a pressure valve and as a honey trap for potential dissidents. Soviet Russia, Communist Cuba, they both kept their populations in a state of permanent revolution, punishing anyone who even thought about standing up to them. Being in permanent revolution means existing in the eternal now. I talked about this in a previous podcast, about why it's so important to read and learn about history, because if you don't, then you're malleable mush for the regime. If you don't know the history of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and post-war reconciliation, then you can be made to believe that there's an unbroken line of traitors from Robert E. Lee to Donald Trump, and that we've always dealt harshly with such people. If you don't know the demographic history of the United States, then you can be made to believe that it's always been an ethnically diverse nation with large numbers of immigrants from all throughout the world. You can even be made to believe that 25, 30, 50% of Americans have always been gay or transgender. If you don't know the history of our country, you can be made to believe that America was always a racist and sexist nation until the present day. It's interesting that leftists will laud civil rights pioneers on the one hand, but then turn around and diminish their accomplishments on the other by claiming that racism and sexism still plague this country to this day. I've recently been watching The Last Dance, the Netflix documentary about Michael Jordan's last year with the Chicago Bulls. It's a fun piece of nostalgia for me, having followed the NBA during my teenage years, but it's also a reminder that claims of systemic racism by the left are a bunch of bunk. During the 1990s, the most popular athlete in America was Michael Jordan. My friends and I never saw him as a black man, but as a great basketball player. One of the most popular baseball players of the day was Ken Griffey Jr., and it was the same thing. We didn't see him as black, but as a great home run hitter and an exciting center fielder. The most popular musicians were Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston. And the most popular political figure in surveys among Republican voters was Colin Powell, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Yet the critical race theorists will tell you that the 90s were awash in racism, and that it continues to this day. The entire power structure of the diversity, equity, and inclusion regime rests on convincing the American people that our country is irredeemably racist and requires their highly paid services to fix it. It's pure self-interest in the guise of social justice. Michael Knowles of the Daily Wire recently interviewed a woman who secretly recorded employees of Pornhub who admitted to not only deliberately enticing children to watch their videos, but also to inserting gay and transgender content into the feeds of straight viewers in the hopes of converting them. For Pornhub, it's a matter of the bottom line. The more addicted to degeneracy people become, the more content they watch, and the more money Pornhub makes. But I think there's something deeper going on there as well. Pornhub recently released a series of maps showing the most searched for topics in various states and countries, and of course it's a bunch of degenerate nonsense that I don't need to go into here. But it made me wonder how much is true, and how much of it is them trying to make it true. Is the tail wagging the dog? It's not enough to have a deviant and degenerate society in the present. They also have to convince us that society has always been deviant and degenerate. The recent scandal of Senate staffers who filmed their homosexual trysts in the Capitol hearing rooms is only the latest example of how degenerate we've really become. Though the staffer was fired, probably only because of the furor on social media, I figure we're not far from a gaslighting campaign to convince us that congressional staffers have always been engaging in gay sex in the U.S. Senate and that it's actually an integral part of our sacred democracy. It goes without saying that children growing up in a country with statues of George Floyd instead of Robert E. Lee or George Washington, and a society that lauds the most deviant rather than the most morally upright, will become a different kind of society. I've quoted talk show host Jesse Kelly before, but it's worth repeating. Quote, "As a country, you will eventually turn into what you look up to. Period. If you idolize scum, you will become scum. If you idolize the greats, you will become great." End quote. Why does the current ruling regime want to turn us into scum? How does that advance their goals? Why do our leaders want to gaslight us, to make us into stupid sheep without the ability to criticize their agenda? I think to ask that question is to answer it. The first step to avoiding a trap is recognizing that a trap exists. We must preserve books, monuments, and the other records of our past before they get rewritten or destroyed as well. As much as I enjoy my Kindle, that means we need libraries of paper books that cannot be remotely edited or deleted. You must learn history and then teach it to your children. We should question supposedly authoritative sources. That doesn't necessarily mean going down every conspiracy theory rabbit hole, but we should maintain a healthy skepticism of whatever the government says is true. Remember the first temptation recorded in Scripture. The serpent said to Eve, "Did God really say?" So it is with our regime, the cathedral, as Moldbug calls it, the amorphous blob of bureaucrats and NGOs that control our society. They will gaslight us. They will rewrite our history to try and control the future. But they do not yet have the complete control that the party did in Orwell's 1984. Our task is not hopeless. In fact, I think we have the upper hand. It might not seem like we do, but we have truth on our side, and that's not nothing. My name is Brian Allman, and this has been the podcast of the Gem State Substack. Subscribe at gemstate.substack.com, and I will see you next time.